Will Iraq slide into civil strife? Supporters of powerful leader Muqtada al Sadr are still occupying the parliament. They're refusing to leave until their demands are met. But what if they aren't? And what role does Iran play in Iraqi politics? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Protesters have once again taken over Iraq's parliament in a show of support for influential Shia leader Muqtada al Sadr. On Saturday, thousands of people stormed the building in Baghdad for the second time in a week. They vowed to stay put until their demands are met, escalating a political standoff. At least 125 people were injured. Sadr's supporters reject the nomination of Mohammed Shia al-Sudani as prime minister. It's been 10 months since the elections, but a deadlock remains over the formation of a new government. Mahmoud Abdul reports from Baghdad.
Once again, supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada al Sadr occupy Iraq's parliament. But this time they vow to stay put until their demands are met.
We reject corruption and corrupt politicians. Sudani is a tool in the hands of foreign powers. He and his colleagues work against Iraq. He wants to do anything for our benefit.
We won't leave until we kick those corrupt politicians out of Iraq.
A pro-Iranian bloc called the Coordination Framework has nominated Mohammed Shia al-Sudani for prime minister. These protesters have linked him to former Premier Nouri al-Maliki.
Despite calls for calm by many officials, including Sadr, who instructed his supporters to refrain from violence, the protests were far from peaceful.
The health ministry has confirmed dozens of people, including soldiers, were injured when police fired tear gas at the crowds.
Everyone shares the responsibility: political parties, the political elite, social forces and influential figures. We have to say it to everyone, and everyone must act wisely, with Iraq in mind, in order not to lose again.
Saturday's parliamentary session had been dedicated to electing a new president, followed by the naming of a prime minister, who would then form a new government. All that is now on hold, giving rival politicians a chance to meet. But these protesters are worried that MPs could hold an unannounced session to approve Sudani. So now they're in for the long haul. Mahmoud Abdul Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
So who is Muqtada al Sadr? The founder of a popular Shia movement. His bloc won 74 seats in October's elections, making it the largest faction in parliament. But last month, Sadr ordered all 74 MPs to resign because of a failure to form a government. Sadr was the leader of a powerful militia, the Mahdi Army, which was founded in 2003 in response to the U.S. invasion. He is a populist who enjoys strong support among poorer Shia communities. Sadr opposes the nomination of Mohammed Shia al-Sudani for prime minister, saying he is too close to Tehran. All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Doha, Zeidon Alkinani, non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. In Baghdad, Marsin Alshamary is a research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative. And in Tehran, Mousavi, a professor of political science at the University of Tehran. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Marsin, let me start with you today. First, I want to ask you, who exactly are these protesters? Are the protesters that are currently engaged in this sit-in in Parliament, the ones who are occupying Parliament, are they only supporters of Muqtada al Sadr? And is what they are seeking representative of what other Iraqis want?
This is a very important question because I think it's very relevant to how impactful these protests are and how much effect they'll have on Iraq going forward. To answer your question, predominantly they are the followers of Muqtada al Sadr, but there are other Iraqis involved in these protests as well, and we might expect more to join later on. But the vast majority of them are Sadrists. But their demands do resonate to some degree with the rest of the country and other Iraqis. For example, where they resonate most strongly is in this call for ending corruption and bringing those who are corrupt to accountability. Where they may be less resonant with Iraqis is their demands for another set of early elections, for an interim government until that happens, and perhaps even for the rewriting of the constitution. So in some ways, they speak to the majority of Iraqis, but in other ways, their demands, particularly for early elections, might actually anger the public more than bring them together.
Zeidon, is there any kind of a solution that can be reached to get beyond this current political stalemate? And also, how much is the rivalry between former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and Muqtada al Sadr driving all of this?
Well, firstly, the solution could be between the coordination framework and the Sadrist movement, but that seems to be very difficult for the past few months due to rivalries and very old rivalries, as you mentioned, the one between former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and Muqtada al Sadr, the leader of the Sadrist movement. However, Maliki's potential for any candidacy towards the Prime Minister role has been very limited or almost abolished after the leak audio where he criticized his very own allies within the coordination framework who have been for months negotiating with Sadr to keep or maintain al-Maliki within the coordination framework. So the crisis here has not only become a crisis or a dispute between two different parties, but it has also led into internal disputes within the very same parties themselves, such as the coordination framework, which is also why we're probably not noticing or witnessing any strong political or even on-ground response from the coordination framework due to the schism or the fragmentation that took place after the leaks. The Sadrist movement or the Sadrist leader is currently focusing on how to create obstacles for the coordination framework, ensuring that it won't take them a shorter time or an easier time to form a government, which he failed to do for the past 10 months, similar to the obstacles they presented to his coalition with Taqaddum and KDP.
Mohammed, how is the Iranian government viewing what is playing out in Iraq right now? And what is Iran's position when it comes to what's happening?
I think Iran does not want unrest in Iraq. I don't think it serves Iran's interest. I don't think it serves Iraq's interest as well. Iran's position is that all factions in Iraq should respect the democratic process. Muqtada al Sadr failed to form a coalition government, and I think he should now provide an opportunity for the opposition to attempt to form a coalition government. While I think many people support the goals of the protesters, I don't think sit-ins and protests will actually achieve the goals they are looking for. Now, I know that there are a lot of discussions among the protesters about interference, about Iran interfering in Iraq's affairs. In reality, I think this is mostly a rivalry between domestic Iraqi groups and domestic Iraqi parties. Iran does enjoy not some, but maybe considerable influence in Iraq, but that doesn't mean that Iran is interfering in Iraqi affairs. So I think ultimately this is mostly a rivalry between domestic political groups in Iraq.
Marsin, you may have heard Zeidon a moment ago talk about fragmentations going on in political blocs right now in Iraq. I want to ask you, from your vantage point, do you believe that Muqtada al Sadr's rivals in the pro-Iran coordination framework bloc, do you believe that they're showing signs of any internal divisions? I'm asking that because, you know, it's been reported on the one hand that there are some leaders in that bloc that want to see dialogue go forth, and there are other leaders within that bloc that would like to see counter demonstrations.
Yeah, let's go back actually a few weeks back to when Muqtada al Sadr was still invested in the political process and in creating a government. And at that time, something that was very telling was that in his pursuit of a majority and opposition government, he actually did reach out to certain segments of the coordination framework, namely almost everyone but former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, in order to get them on his side and to collaborate with them and to marginalize Maliki in the process. So what we see here is their unwillingness to step away from the coordination framework and to form an alliance with Sadr back then, which actually speaks to the remarkable connectedness and the remarkable degree of unitedness that they're showing at this point. This, I don't think, is really based on any ideology, but more of a calculation that united they are a threat or they are immensely powerful when put up against Muqtada al Sadr, but if they go to his side, then it weakens them individually. So I think that's a calculus that they made back when the offer was even more attractive than it is right now. And I think right now we do see different kinds of messages from different leaders in the coordination framework, but they don't seem to be messages that are countervailing messages in any way. So mostly they have been calling for the protection of public property, for dialogue, and for really doing things within the outlines of the law and of procedures that are enshrined in the state. So they do represent a somewhat united front, and we can't really expect them to be more united than this because they are a group of very powerful individuals, some with paramilitary groups, who have been accustomed to being independently strong actors. So it's a multipolar kind of setup, the coordination framework, rather than a hegemonic or a unipolar one with Maliki at the top.
Zeidon, is it any surprise to you that Muqtada al Sadr's supporters were able to enter parliament and that they are able to stay there now? And from your perspective, how long might we see parliament occupied by these protesters?
Not at all. Unfortunately, the reality in Iraq is that most of these political parties with armed wings, as mentioned by Marsin, are people that are able to infiltrate and bypass many security military checkpoints. This is very easy when comparing them to the October 2019 protest movement, when protesters tried to access a few bridges that would lead them to Tahrir Square, which is a public square, and they were met with political violence, either from the political parties that are currently in dispute today, or from their armed wings, or from a third hidden party, as the governmental media likes to refer to them, to push away or hide away the accusation from the political parties that are involved in assassinating these protesters. Unfortunately, the political parties in disputes or blocks, which is the coordination framework and the Sadrist movement, equally are able to bypass any military checkpoint and face any governmental premises and enter any governmental building without facing the similar consequences that were faced by the peaceful protesters.
Hamid, how did the relationship between Muqtada al Sadr and Iran get so bad? What went wrong?
Well, actually, Muqtada al Sadr has spent considerable time in Iran, especially in the city of Qom, in the past 2 decades. He has repeatedly come to Iran. He even met Iran's supreme leader numerous times in the past decade. It's very difficult to tell exactly what went wrong. One theory is that Muqtada al Sadr is a person who he changes his mind very frequently. Another reason perhaps can be that he had a quite good relationship with Qasem Soleimani. After his death, perhaps that's not existing anymore. But ultimately, I think he's a person who's he's very neurotic, and he seems to be changing his mind very frequently. But in the past year, I think relations between Iran and Muqtada al Sadr have become very bad.
Marsin, how involved is Iran right now in Iraq? Obviously, they've been involved in Iraq for a long time. But is it a more hands-off approach at the moment, or is there a lot of pressure being brought to bear on Iraq by Iran right now?
Well, when government formation was still underway, in the sense that Muqtada al Sadr was invested in it, there was Iranian involvement in the sense of diplomatic pressure and presence in order to get the various groups in Iraq to come to an agreement, simply because of how long it was taking. Iran will always have influence to some degree in Iraq, but this particular government formation cycle, I think foreign intervention in Iraqi politics has been less than usual, not non-existent. What is interesting, though, is basically Muqtada al Sadr's bid to form a majority government with his Kurdish and Sunni allies was something that was supported by a lot of Arab countries in the region, and we see that their intervention in trying to push this through has failed. So there are various foreign actors who are invested in the outcome of Iraq's election and government formation.
Zeidon, how concerned are you right now that Iraq could slide into real civil strife? I mean, what are the chances this could get much worse and that violence could play out in the days or months ahead?
Well, a lot of the armed wings or former armed wings that belong to a lot of the political parties, whether it be the Sadrist movement or the ones within the coordination framework, do have a history of an armed conflict, particularly when we talk about the traditional, the historical Maliki and Sadr rivalry. It existed since 2006. Some of the political parties within the coordination framework splitted out of the Sadrist movement in the early stages of the US invasion. So there is a history of civil strife. However, the possibility might be a bit lower than in the early stages of the US invasion. There are more platforms of dialogue. There are more political parties and political individuals that are very powerful in today's Iraq that would rather continue or take this forward in a peaceful dialogue, because Iraq is going through, since October 2019 protest movement, the political system or the political class of post-2003 Iraq is going through a very drastic transitionary period where it is determined whether this political system will survive, whether this ethnic sectarian political system will survive. It has been questioned by the rising political consciousness of the youth, of the civil society. The international community is also realizing the alarming effects of the failures of this political class towards education, public goods, public services, and the sovereignty of the Iraqi borders, including the alarming impacts on Iraqi sovereignty from equally from different regional power players, including Iran. So this is certainly an issue that will be considered in the long term. However, there will be more platforms of dialogue that could ensure that this crisis is more political than it really relates to the daily lives of ordinary Iraqi citizens. Sure, the Sadrist movement does buy the hearts and minds of so many people across the spectrum when it comes to nationalism and reform, but in reality, as we noticed in the lowest voter turnout since the establishment of the current Iraqi democratic system, it proves that most Iraqis do not affiliate themselves with these political parties, and they do not affiliate with themselves with this political system, and they hope to see a different political system.
Zeidon, it's interesting you're bringing up these mass protests that happened in 2019. I was in Baghdad, covered many of those protests in October and November of that year in 2019. And I encountered so many members of these youth protesters who said they had no faith in the government whatsoever. They wanted a complete overhaul of the political system. I'm curious to get your perspective if you think that there is a chance that we might see mass protests again like what we saw in 2019.
There is a very big possibility that we will witness similar mass protests. However, unfortunately, the focus or the momentum of the protest movement has lowered due to a lot of distractions that dragged away the attention from the protest movement, and it also created a lot of pessimism amongst the Iraqi youth. As you probably recall, right after shortly after the breakout of the October 2019 protest movement, we witnessed a lot of destabilizing events that took place, whether it was the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, whether it was the political violence attempts committed by the armed wings of the political parties within the Iraqi government towards the peaceful protesters, or the political failures in ensuring to create a caretaker government that would be different from the similar faces or from the similar political parties and interest groups that the people initially revolted against from the first place. So this might be just another event or incident or another series of incidents that will distract the people, pull the people away from giving them hope that change is possible by only protesting. However, currently the ball is in the court of the political parties that are trying in one way or another to save this political system. However, if you have players such as Muqtada al Sadr, who would like to redefine the political system under his own terms for objectives that he had planned a very long time ago.
Mohammed, what steps do you think we'll see Iran take if what is happening now in Iraq escalates and if it causes serious instability?
Well, I think this is happening at a very sensitive time for Iran. I don't think Iran wants this unrest to continue. Iran is currently engaged in very sensitive negotiations on its nuclear issue with the United States. It's also engaged in negotiations with Saudi Arabia, where Iraq is actually hosting these negotiations. So I think these unrests are actually happening at a very bad time for Iran. And I think Iran wants these unrests to end as soon as possible. Nevertheless, I don't think Iran has the necessary influence and the necessary tools to end this. I think Iran will try to negotiate and facilitate negotiation between the two sides. But as I said before, I think the relationship between Iran and Muqtada al Sadr has deteriorated in the past year. Ghani, which is the new head of the Quds force of Iran, he doesn't enjoy the same kind of relationship that Soleimani enjoyed with Muqtada al Sadr. So I think ultimately Iran has to engage with some sort of negotiation with Muqtada al Sadr to fix the situation.
Marsin, briefly, I want to ask you about how bad is the situation currently for ordinary Iraqi citizens? I mean, we're talking about a political stalemate, we're talking about a political crisis, but how is all this impacting citizens in a country where there is such high unemployment, where they've not been able to approve a budget, where there's joblessness, where people are so frustrated? How bad are things getting for normal, everyday, average Iraqis?
The last 10 months have honestly been excruciating for the average Iraqi because of the lack of government. And as you said, the lack of a budget, there hasn't really been any room to implement any improvements in terms of public services or to be able to provide for employment through private sector and sadly through public sector as well, which is unadvisable, but Iraqis do look towards that. Everyday citizens are quite fed up with the impasse. It has been the longest impasse in Iraq's post-2003 history. So it is making life really difficult for everyone, particularly as the climate crisis has hit Iraq really hard with continuous sandstorms occurring on several times a month that have made everyday life very, very difficult. When it comes to this actual protest movement and its effect on everyday life, to be honest, its effect on traffic and on the streets in Baghdad hasn't been very noticeable. There's been less people outside of their homes than usual, but the city, the high alert in the city is really contained to the areas around the international zone.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave our conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Zeidon Alkinani, Marsin Alshamary, and Hamid Mousavi. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.